I was 37 when I took the ranger job out in the Pacific Northwest, near the edge of the Deschutes National Forest in Oregon. It was late August 2016. I'd been in state park work for years, bouncing around between New Mexico, Colorado, and finally landing the spot outside a small logging town called Cinder Ridge. The pay was average, but I liked the solitude.
No crowds.
No traffic, just forest, trails, and the deep quiet that you only get when you're miles from anyone. I was assigned a seasonal cabin used mostly by fire watch and trail maintenance staff. It sat at the end of a rough gravel road, 12 miles from the nearest ranger station. My job was to monitor some backcountry trails and fire roads, log any fallen trees, and check for campers sneaking in without permits. Pretty low-key work. The cabin was small and old but solid. One room, wood-framed, tin roof, and a wood stove that creaked when the temperature dropped. There was a storage shed behind it full of rusted tools, a few jugs of fuel, and a bear-proof box where I kept food. I didn't have running water, just a hand pump 100 feet down the hill and a composting toilet in a wooden outhouse. My nearest coworker was a guy named Perry who manned a radio tower about 5 miles east. We checked in once a day by radio, but I only saw him in person once a week when he'd bring in supplies with the Forest Service truck. Other than that, I was alone. No cell signal, no Wi-Fi. I didn't mind. The days passed slow. Mornings were spent clearing brush from trails, checking footpaths for signs of poaching, and logging treefall. I kept to a strict routine, up by 6, on the trails by 7, back by late afternoon. I'd cook over the propane burner, read old paperbacks, and sit out on the porch watching the light drain out of the trees. Nights were dead quiet except for the wind in the pines and the occasional yelp of a coyote. But it didn't stay quiet for long. It started the second week of September. I came back from my day loop around Pine Hollow Trail and found the cabin door slightly open. I never left it open. I always checked the latch twice before heading out. But now it was standing just a couple inches ajar, like someone had gently pushed it in. I stood there a while, just staring at it. I looked around, nothing seemed disturbed outside. The firewood was stacked neatly. My axe was where I left it, leaning against the porch. I stepped up, slowly pushed the door open, and peeked inside. Nothing looked off. My cot was still made, stove cold, food locker unopened. The only thing I noticed was that my logbook, the one I kept notes in every day, was sitting on the floor under the window instead of on the shelf where I always left it. I bent down, picked it up, and flipped through the pages. Everything was in order. Same scribbled notes, weather updates, trail conditions. But still, it nagged at me. I chalked it up to the wind. Maybe I hadn't latched it all the way. Maybe I bumped the book and it fell. I didn't like the thought of someone else being out there, especially not someone sneaking around my cabin. But I figured if it was anything serious, there'd be signs, tracks, broken windows, something. That night, I kept the lantern lit a little longer than usual and left the axe next to the bed. 2 nights later, I woke up to a faint tapping sound. It wasn't loud, just a light tap like wood ticking against metal. I sat up, unsure if I was dreaming. I listened. Nothing. I stayed awake for almost an hour, ears sharp. But there was only the wind. By morning, I told myself it had been a tree branch scraping the roof. The next day, I found a boot print outside the cabin door. It was fresh, still sharp in the mud. It wasn't mine. I wore size 10s, flat-soled hikers. This one had a deeper tread, narrow heel, and looked a size or 2 bigger. Faced the door, toes angled in. I stared at it a long time, then walked the perimeter, looking for more. I found 2 other faint impressions, one behind the shed and another by the path that led toward the old service road. That part of the forest wasn't used anymore. It hadn't been maintained since the 90s. I'd never seen anyone go that way. I didn't have a gun, just bear spray and a flare kit, but I kept the axe closer after that. A few more days passed without anything weird. Then one morning I woke up and noticed the shed door was open, just swinging slowly in the wind. I always latched it. I walked down with the axe in hand, heart thumping. Inside, a few items were moved. One of the fuel jugs was uncapped. The old busted chainsaw someone left years ago had been dragged forward a foot. Pry bar was gone. Nothing else taken. I started sleeping less. Every little creak made me sit up, heart racing. I started logging things I heard at night. Scratching, footsteps or what sounded like them. Always distant, like someone circling the area just out of sight. 2 days later, I found a dead bird nailed to the side of the outhouse. A woodpecker, dried blood, wings limp, beak split, nailed through the chest with an old, bent nail. I stared at it for a long time, then pulled it off and buried it out behind the shed. I didn't tell anyone on the radio. I knew how it would sound. They'd think I was rattled from being alone too long. That night I didn't sleep. Every hour or so I heard snapping twigs, a rustle of leaves. Once, I could have sworn I saw a shape out by the trees, just past the edge of my lantern light. A man, not moving, just standing. I didn't move either. I sat there with my axe in hand, eyes locked on that spot, waiting, but nothing came forward. Eventually, the shape faded back into the black. That morning, I made a decision. I'd hike down to Perry's station and report it. If someone was out here messing with cabins, we needed to know. I packed a day bag, strapped on my boots, and left around 7 a.m. The path to Perry's was narrow and took me through old growth that hadn't been cleared in years. About 3 miles in, I came across something that stopped me cold. A rope, tied between 2 trees, about waist high, strung tight across the trail. It looked like a tripwire. If I hadn't been watching the ground, I would have walked right into it. I stepped back, heart pounding. The rope was thin, covered in moss to blend in. Someone had taken time to set this. I looked around, trying to see if anyone was nearby, but the forest was silent. I untied the rope and kept moving. I reached Perry's tower just after noon. He wasn't there. I checked the radio hut, no sign of him. His cot was empty, food untouched. His water jug was full. The door was unlocked. The truck was gone. I tried the radio. No signal. Static. I waited 4 hours. Nothing. Eventually, I hiked back. The whole way I felt watched. I stopped every few minutes and looked behind me. Nothing there. Not a squirrel. Not a bird. Just thick forest and a strange quiet that didn't belong. That night, when I got back, the cabin smelled different, like sweat and damp wood. And when I went to check the cot, I found a fresh footprint inside. In the dust under the window, bigger than mine, same tread as before. Someone had been inside while I was gone. That was the last night I stayed there. I packed at first light, took only what I could carry, my maps, the logbook, 2 canteens, a few bars of food. I left the rest. I didn't care. I needed to get out. The main ranger station was a full day's hike down the ridge, but I knew the path. The whole hike I kept scanning the trees, listening. At one point I heard something move through the brush behind me. Fast, quiet. I turned and saw nothing. I picked up speed. Around mid-afternoon, I came to a wooden footbridge over a narrow ravine. As I crossed, I caught a glimpse of something wedged under the slats. Piece of my logbook. Just one torn page, folded and tucked into the beams. My own handwriting, but with something else written beneath it in red ink. It just said, "I see you too." I dropped it. I didn't want to know anything else. I reached the ranger station just before dark. The staff there looked confused when I showed up unannounced. I told them someone was messing around the cabins, trespassing, stealing tools, maybe worse. I left out the details. I knew how it sounded. They sent a team up the next morning. 3 rangers, armed. When they got there, the cabin was trashed. Food locker open. Pages of my logbook scattered all over the floor. X missing. Shed door torn off its hinges. No sign of anyone, but they did find something behind the cabin. A pile of burnt clothes, pair of boots, not mine, bigger size, and a crude map of the area carved into the side of a tree, with my cabin circled in deep scratches. They never found who did it.
No prints.
No DNA. No one ever claimed the boots or came forward. Perry showed up 2 days later. Said he'd been at a hospital, his appendix burst. He didn't tell anyone when he left because he was in too much pain. He figured no one would be checking in that week. I don't blame him, but it means I really was alone up there. Or I should have been. I never went back. I left the job at the end of the season. Moved to Nevada, got work doing maintenance at a wildlife refuge. Still out in nature, still quiet, but never alone anymore. Not like that. Sometimes I think about that cabin, about how someone was up there too, watching me, walking around my place when I slept, stepping over my things, listening, planning. I wonder how long he'd been there before I noticed, and I wonder if he's still up there now. It was October 2022 when I agreed to help clean out my uncle's old farm property in rural Arkansas. I was 26 at the time, living in Fort Smith, working a boring job at a tire warehouse. I hadn't seen my Uncle Ray in a while, but when he passed from a stroke, his property got left to my cousin Derek, who lived in Missouri and didn't want anything to do with it. He called me up, said if I helped clear out the old cabin and barn, I could stay there for a while and maybe even keep some stuff if I wanted. I didn't have anything tying me down.
No girlfriend. No pets.
Just tired of the warehouse noise and the same 12-hour shifts. I thought maybe a few quiet days out on the farm would clear my head. Ray's farm was way out near the border with Oklahoma, about 45 minutes off the nearest paved road. It had been abandoned for about 6 years. Ever since Ray's health took a dive, my dad used to tell me stories about how Ray always kept to himself, hunting deer and fixing old engines. The cabin he lived in was built by our grandfather in the 70s. No insulation, one floor, beat-up wood exterior, surrounded by open fields and dense pine woods on all sides. I packed some essentials, clothes, my Glock 19, a cooler full of food, bottled water, sleeping bag, flashlight, battery pack for my phone, and a couple of tools, and headed out there early on a Thursday morning. It was a gray day, not raining, but the sky looked heavy like it might later. The drive down those gravel roads felt longer than I remembered. I passed 3 other houses total in the last 20 miles. By the time I pulled up to the property, I could already tell this place had been left to rot. The grass around the driveway was waist-high. The front fence had collapsed inward. Weeds were growing up through the porch planks, and the metal roof of the barn behind the cabin was completely rusted through in spots. I parked near the porch and stepped out. The smell of damp wood, soil, and old rot hit me immediately. The air felt different, still and too quiet.
No bird sounds.
Not even wind rustling the grass. Just this dead, muggy silence. I unlocked the door with the old key Derek mailed me. The hinges screamed as I opened it. Inside, it was like time froze. The same table Ray used to eat at, same recliner, same hunting magazines scattered across the dusty counter. I walked around a bit, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light coming through the grimy windows. Everything was covered in dust. Mouse droppings on the floor. A raccoon had probably gotten in at some point. I found a torn open box of oatmeal near the pantry with scratch marks on it. The fridge was unplugged. Thank God. The bathroom was barely usable, but the cabin had a working wood stove and the roof hadn't caved in yet, so I figured I'd rough it for a few days. The first night was quiet. I sat out on the porch with a beer, listening to the stillness, trying to relax. The tree line about 200 yards away looked like a black wall once the sun went down. I used my phone flashlight to walk back inside, then laid out my sleeping bag on the old mattress Ray used to sleep on. It felt weird, but I was too tired to care. At some point around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up needing to piss. I stepped outside barefoot using the flashlight. That's when I saw something strange. There were tire tracks in the dirt path leading up behind the barn. Fresh ones. I hadn't noticed them earlier. They curved around to the back of the property and disappeared near the old grain shed. The problem was, I hadn't driven around back. My truck was still parked where I left it, and no one else was supposed to be out here. I froze for a minute, just listening. No engine, no voices, nothing. Just the creaking of the trees in the distance. I walked a few feet out into the yard and shined the light toward the barn, but everything was dark. I figured maybe they were just old tracks from before the rain. The ground was soft out here, and you could still see marks days after. Still, something about them made me uneasy. I pissed near the woodpile and went back inside, locking the door this time and sliding a chair under the knob. The next day, I tried to keep busy. Hauled some junk out of the pantry, found an old box of photos from the 90s, tossed broken furniture onto a pile outside. I stayed close to the cabin mostly, didn't feel right wandering too far. That evening, I walked out to the barn. Inside was darker than I expected. A lot of Ray's old tools were scattered on a bench, rusted over. Oil stains on the dirt floor, animal droppings in the corners. The barn doors had no lock, so I tied them shut with rope from the truck just to be safe. When I came back out, I checked those tire tracks again. They were deeper now. A second set overlapped the first, heading the same direction but angled slightly off. The ground was still damp, and you could clearly see the treads. Someone had definitely driven back here again, sometime after I arrived. I didn't see any new tracks coming in, which meant they'd driven in from somewhere else, maybe from the woods. I knew there wasn't a proper road past the back edge of the property, just forest. I grabbed my pistol from the truck and kept it in my jacket after that. That second night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there listening, eyes open, stomach tight. I kept thinking I heard footsteps on the porch, twigs snapping. I held the pistol in my hand the entire time. Around 4 a.m., I finally passed out. In the morning, I went out and saw something that made my stomach drop. The rope I used to tie the barn doors shut had been cut. Clean slice like with a blade. I walked around the back and found a fresh cigarette butt on the ground. Still smelled like tobacco. I hadn't smoked in years. No one else was supposed to be here. I started considering packing up and leaving, but something stubborn in me wanted to finish the job. I told myself I'd stay one more night, then drive out in the morning. That afternoon, I noticed something else. Out in the field, just before the tree line, there was a figure standing. Too far to see clearly, but definitely a person. Just standing still, watching. I froze on the porch, staring back. After maybe 10 seconds, they slowly turned and walked into the trees. I rushed to grab the binoculars I found in one of Ray's storage boxes. But by the time I scanned the area, whoever it was had vanished. I walked out a little way, heart racing, but didn't want to go all the way out there. Not alone, not without cell service. That evening, I locked the cabin up tight, barricaded the door with a dresser, shut the windows, kept the pistol in my hand as I laid on the mattress. Around 11 p.m., I heard movement outside. Heavy footsteps, the kind that crunched the dry grass. Slow, deliberate, then a soft tap on the window. Not like someone knocking to be polite, more like they were checking something. I didn't move, just laid there, breathing as quiet as I could. The footsteps moved to the back of the cabin, then stopped for a long time. After a while, I heard the porch creak again, then silence. I stayed up until dawn, not moving. When the sun finally came up, I packed everything in a frenzy. Left half the supplies, didn't care. I just wanted to get out. But when I walked out to the truck, I found the tires slashed. All four. Panicked, I started scanning the woods with my pistol drawn, spinning around like a madman. But there was no one. I grabbed my backpack and started walking down the dirt road, deciding to hike the 18 miles back toward the county road. I had enough water to make it. About a mile down, I heard an engine rumble faintly behind me. I turned and saw a beat-up Chevy pickup easing out from the trail behind Ray's barn. It hadn't been parked near the cabin. It must have been back in the trees. I ran, full sprint, cutting through brush, nearly twisting my ankle. I dove into a dry creek bed and laid flat, listening. The truck rumbled down the road slowly, stopped, then kept going. I stayed there an hour before I moved again. Took me most of the day to make it out to the county highway. I flagged down a passing tractor around sunset. The driver let me use his phone to call Derek, who drove down the next morning and picked me up from a gas station. I never went back to that farm. A week later, Derek sent someone to retrieve the rest of the junk from the cabin. The guy he hired called us after and said someone had broken in again. The cabin was trashed, holes punched through the walls, dead squirrels hung on nails in the barn. Carving on the inside door read, "Stay gone." We reported it to the local sheriff's office. They shrugged it off, said probably meth heads or squatters from across the border. But I know someone had been watching me since the first night. Whoever lived out there or hid out there didn't want the place disturbed, and I'll never step foot on that land again. It was the fall of 2016, and I had just turned 29. My name is Thomas Harner, and I live in northern Arizona. That year was a turning point for me. I had just gotten out of a long relationship, and the breakup hit harder than I expected. To clear my head, I started doing weekend trips in the backcountry. I wasn't some expert survivalist, but I'd been camping and hiking since I was a kid with my dad. And over the years, I'd gotten comfortable being out in the woods alone. I took a lot of solo hikes that fall, but the one that stuck with me, haunted me really, was a trip I made to a small, rarely mentioned area near Tonto Basin. There was this rundown old cabin I'd heard about through a friend of a friend who was into Arizona mining history. The cabin was supposed to be a leftover from some failed silver operation in the early 1900s. It was off any official trail and only reachable by hiking about 6 miles from a gravel road that itself was barely drivable. He said the cabin was sketchy looking but still standing, and if I wanted quiet, it didn't get more quiet than that. That was all I needed to hear. I packed light, small sleeping bag, tarp, propane burner, basic food, .22 rifle for snakes and wild dogs, and enough water for 2 days. It was supposed to be just one overnight, in and out. The weather was dry and cool, perfect for hiking and camping without getting cooked during the day or freezing at night. I drove up early on a Saturday morning, left my truck near a small clearing where 2 dirt paths crossed, and hiked in. The trail was more of a suggestion than an actual trail. It was narrow, unmaintained, and twisted through scrub brush and sections of pine. I didn't see another person the entire way. I reached the cabin a little before 3 p.m. It sat in a small, dry valley surrounded by hills and thick clusters of juniper and pinyon pine. From a distance, the cabin looked like it had given up a long time ago. Roof sagging, boards gray and splintered, windows gone or boarded shut. But when I got closer, I realized it wasn't completely falling apart. The main frame was still strong, and someone had patched the roof with metal sheeting. Someone had tried to keep this place from disappearing completely. The door was hanging off its hinges, but inside, it was surprisingly clean. Dusty, yes, but not full of junk or nests or dead animals like I'd expected. There was a small stone fireplace with half-burned logs in it. A cot with a ripped canvas sling sat in the corner. There was even an old iron stove bolted to the floor. It gave me the weird feeling that someone had been using the place not too long ago. I dropped my pack, sat down, and just listened. Total silence.
No planes, no wind, no bugs, no birds.
Just the crackle of leaves under my boots. That was the first time I felt off. But I shook it off and figured the lack of wildlife might just be due to the season or the time of day. I stepped back outside and did a quick loop around the cabin to get the lay of the land. There were old metal tools leaning against the back wall: pickaxe, shovel, bucket. They were rusted beyond use, but they hadn't moved in a long time. A few yards beyond that was a pit that looked like a collapsed mine entrance. No danger signs or fencing, just rocks and debris. I boiled water, ate a freeze-dried meal, and watched the sun dip behind the hills. It got dark fast. I didn't have a tent, just my tarp and sleeping bag, so I laid everything out inside the cabin. I propped the door back in place as best I could and set up my little camp inside. It wasn't cozy, but it felt protected, and I liked that. Just as I was settling in for the night, I heard something, a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't close, but it was distinct, like a person dragging their feet through gravel and dry brush. But slower than that, a kind of uneven scrape and crunch, like someone favoring one leg. It stopped. Then it started again, this time slightly closer. I froze. I wasn't sure if it was an animal or a person or something else, but it didn't match any sound I knew. I turned off my headlamp and listened harder. My heart started racing. It stopped again. I couldn't tell where it had gone. Maybe behind the cabin, or maybe up the ridge to the left. I waited. I don't know how long, maybe 10 minutes. Then I heard it again, this time fainter, moving away. The sound just faded out into the dark. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I told myself it could have been a deer, or a coyote with a limp. I told myself the dry air distorted sound and made things feel closer or bigger than they were. I told myself a lot of things that night. I didn't sleep well. Every time I started drifting off, I'd jerk awake thinking I heard something. I ended up just lying there with my rifle across my chest, waiting for daylight. When the sun finally rose, I felt foolish. Nothing had happened. I ate a cold breakfast bar, packed up slowly, and walked a few hundred feet from the cabin to take a leak. That's when I noticed something strange. About 20 yards behind the cabin, near the edge of the tree line, the dirt was disturbed. It looked like someone had dug or dragged something there recently. It wasn't a clear path, more like a scuffed area of dirt and pine needles. I walked over and saw what looked like a boot print, just one. I squatted down and stared at it. The heel and toe were clear, but the middle was smeared like someone had twisted their foot mid-step. I checked all around, nothing else. No second print, no sign of where it had come from or gone to. I didn't feel curious anymore. I felt hunted. I packed the last of my gear in silence and decided to take a different route back. I didn't want to pass through the same section where I'd heard the noise the night before. I had my compass and a paper topo map, and I figured if I cut across a nearby ridge, I could drop back onto the trail about a mile down. That was a mistake. The ridge was steeper than it looked, and the ground was loose with dry rock and gravel. I slipped a few times, scratched my arms, and by the time I made it to the other side, I was off by at least half a mile from where I thought I'd end up. I kept pushing forward anyway, certain the trail was just ahead. Then I found something that made my stomach turn. A dead goat, just lying there, bloated and stiff.
No collar, no markings.
Looked like it had been dead for maybe a day. It had a deep gash along its side, clean, like it was cut, not torn. But there were no bite marks, no signs of struggle, just a single wound. I stepped back and kept moving. The whole way back, I felt like something was watching me. I didn't see anything, no person, no animal, but I stopped several times thinking I heard footsteps in the brush. When I finally reached the dirt road where my truck was parked, I felt this enormous wave of relief. Except my truck had been messed with. Nothing major, Nothing broken, but someone had opened the driver's side door. I knew I had locked it, I always do, but it wasn't locked now. The glove box was open. My backpack, which I'd left in the cab, had been unzipped and dug through. Nothing was missing that I could see, but someone had definitely been in it. That confirmed everything I was feeling. I wasn't alone out there. I drove straight home, didn't stop once, didn't even look in the rearview mirror unless I had to. When I got back to my apartment in Flagstaff, I spent hours just sitting on the couch, trying to decide what to do. Who would I even tell? The police? What would I say? I think someone limped around my cabin and opened my truck while I was hiking. It wasn't illegal to walk around the woods. It wasn't illegal to touch an unlocked car out in the middle of nowhere. I let it go, or I tried to. A week later, I was browsing a small Arizona hiking forum I used to visit now and then. A guy had posted about hearing rumors of skinwalkers near Tonto Basin. He said his cousin saw a man walking like a dog near an old mine shaft out that way. He joked about it, called it desert madness, said maybe it was a tweaker living off the grid. I didn't comment. I just read it twice and logged off. That was almost 9 years ago now. I haven't been back since. I still hike, but never solo anymore. Never that deep. I stopped telling people about what happened because it never sounded that serious when I said it out loud. But here's what I know. Someone or something was out there near that cabin. It wasn't a ghost or a monster or a spirit. It was a person. Someone with a limp or pretending to limp. Someone who didn't want to be found. Someone who watched me, followed me, and maybe even walked right up to the door of that cabin while I slept. Maybe they'd been living out there longer than anyone realized. Call it what you want. Desert hermit, skinwalker, drifter, I don't care. But if you ever find yourself thinking about camping alone near Tonto Basin, do yourself a favor, don't. Not because of what's out there, but because of what's watching you walk in, and what might be waiting for you not to walk out. My name's Aaron. I'm 33 years old. This happened to me back in late October of 2021, up in northern Minnesota, where my grandfather used to own a small off-grid cabin. It wasn't a big place, just a simple one-room structure he built himself back in the early 70s, tucked deep into the pine forest about 12 miles from the nearest paved road. He passed away in 2016, and for a long time, no one in the family touched the place. It just sat there, collecting dust and probably raccoons. That fall, I decided I needed to get away from the city for a while. Things had been piling up in my head. Work stress, a breakup that left me rattled, and just the general suffocation of city life. The cabin seemed like a good way to reset. No phone service, no internet, no neighbors for miles. I thought it'd be peaceful, maybe even healing. I didn't know that peace and isolation could turn so fast into something else, something cold and sharp. The plan was to spend a full week up there. I packed light, canned food, bottled water, some tools, a solar charger, a hunting rifle, a tarp, flashlight, batteries, first aid kit, and a few paperbacks. I brought my dog 2 Max, a 5-year-old shepherd mix who had been with me through thick and thin. He loved the woods, and I figured having him around would make things feel a little less lonely. The drive up took most of the day. Once I turned off the main highway, it was another 40 minutes of crawling over rutted logging roads that had clearly been in use for years. I had to stop a few times to clear fallen branches. The air changed out there, got heavier, quieter. Not dead quiet, but thick with that kind of hush where even the wind feels like it's listening. I reached the cabin late in the afternoon. It looked about like I remembered it from the one time I'd visited as a kid. Dark brown planks faded to gray, tin roof half rusted, a porch sagging slightly to one side. A couple of the windows were boarded up, but the front door was still solid. No lock, just a heavy wooden latch. Max jumped out of the truck the second I stopped and started sniffing around like crazy. Tail stiff, ears up. I figured he was just excited, smelling deer or rabbits. I didn't think much of it then. Inside the cabin, it was dusty and stale but intact. The place was bare bones. Just a cot, a wood stove, an old table, and a few mismatched chairs. The windows let in just enough fading light to see. I spent the first hour cleaning up, sweeping mouse droppings out, clearing cobwebs, and airing out the place. Max wouldn't come inside at first. He kept pacing the porch, staring out toward the tree line like he was waiting for something. Eventually, I got him in with some jerky. That night was calm. I got the fire going, heated up a can of chili, and read by flashlight until my eyes started to close. Max slept at the foot of the cot. The quiet was real. No traffic, no voices, just the crackle of the fire and the wind brushing against the old roof. But by the second night, things started to feel off. It began with Max. Around 1 a.m., he started growling low in his throat. I sat up, heart hammering. The fire was just embers by then, and the room was dim, lit only by moonlight through the window. I listened, holding my breath. Nothing. No sound, no footsteps, no animals. Just Max growling in the dark. He stood up, paced to the door, and let out one single bark. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch with the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the trees. The forest just stared back. Nothing moved. No eyes reflected.
No crunching branches.
After a few minutes, I closed the door and sat with Max until he calmed down. Maybe it was a deer, maybe something smaller, but that happened again the next night. Same time, same low growl, same focused attention toward the woods. But this time, I noticed something else. There were boot prints on the porch, not my own. I hadn't left the cabin since I arrived, except to chop firewood just behind the structure. These prints were big, bigger than mine, and muddy, tracked in a straight line from the woods to the porch and then back again. I stared at them for a long time, counted them. 7 steps up to the porch, 7 back. That was it. No prints circling the cabin, no signs of someone standing or waiting, just forward then back. I looked out at the trees for a long time that morning, trying to spot movement, trying to tell myself there was some normal explanation. Maybe a hunter passing through, maybe even a lost hiker. But who walks through thick forest to a boarded-up cabin and leaves again without knocking, calling out, or leaving a note? That night, I didn't sleep well. Max was on edge too. Every little sound made my skin jump. When the wind knocked a branch against the roof, I nearly reached for the rifle. Felt ridiculous being that tense, but I couldn't shake the unease. By the 4th day, I noticed more signs. Little things, small changes. The axe I'd leaned against the porch was lying flat on the ground. The tin cup I'd left on the table was on the floor, as if it had been knocked off. One of the window boards at the back looked slightly more loose than before, like it had been tugged or rattled. I didn't remember doing any of that. I'm the kind of guy who remembers where I put things. Maybe it was the wind, maybe animals, but it didn't feel like animals. It felt deliberate, like someone was testing the place, seeing how far they could push without me noticing. That evening, I walked the perimeter of the cabin with Max. We went about 30 yards out in every direction, flashlight in one hand, rifle slung over my shoulder. I didn't find anything. No signs of campfires, no recent footprints, no gear, no discarded wrappers or cigarette butts. Nothing. But Max found something. He started pulling at the leash hard, dragging me toward a narrow game trail that twisted east into thicker trees. He was barking now, short, loud bursts, his hackles raised. I looked down and saw what he'd been smelling. A piece of fabric, caught on a broken branch about 3 feet off the ground. Gray, thick, like from a jacket or work pants. It looked weathered but not old.
No mold, no rot.
I stuffed it in my jacket and pulled Max back toward the cabin. That night, I pushed a chair under the doorknob, loaded the rifle. Max didn't sleep. Neither did I. By the fifth night, I was done pretending this was all in my head. At around 3 a.m., I woke to a soft tapping. Not loud, just a soft, rhythmic tap against the wall. Not the door, not the windows, the wall, like someone was dragging fingers or something light across the boards. I didn't move at first, just listened, kept going. Tap, tap, pause, then again. It circled the cabin slowly, like someone walking just out of view, brushing the wall as they went.
Max was silent, stiff beside me.
Ears forward, body frozen. I sat up and aimed the rifle at the door, heart beating like a drum. I waited. The tapping stopped at the back wall. Then nothing.
No footsteps.
No sound. Just the wind and the thud of my pulse in my ears. Then Max barked once, loud and sharp. I flinched and stood, yanked the door open, and swept the flashlight across the yard. And there he was, a man, maybe 40 yards out, standing perfectly still between two trees. He wasn't moving, not even swaying, just watching. The flashlight beam caught him for only a second before he stepped back into the darkness. Not ran, just stepped. I shouted. Useless. My throat was dry. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, frozen. I didn't sleep after that. Just sat in the dark with the rifle, waiting for light. The next morning, I packed everything. Max stayed close. He wouldn't even go outside to relieve himself without me right there. I loaded the truck in minutes and got out. I didn't look back at the cabin once. As I drove down the trail, the forest pressing in from both sides, I saw something that made me slam the brakes. A fresh boot print, right in the middle of the path, facing the way I'd come, deep, clean, centered. Someone had been following the cabin, watching, maybe since day one. I made it to the highway around noon, stopped only once for gas, and I swear the moment I stepped out of the truck, I almost cried from relief just hearing other people's voices again. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. I didn't report it. What would I even say? That a man watched my cabin from the trees and left no sign except his silence? That he walked the woods at night tapping on the walls? I kept the piece of fabric. It's in a drawer back home. Sometimes I take it out and look at it. I thought about going back, just to see if he's still there. But I know better now. I know what kind of silence lives in those woods, and I'll never go back. It was late October 2016 when I decided to build a small off-grid cabin on my uncle's old property in rural Arkansas. I was 29 at the time, worn out from city life in Dallas, and tired of the constant traffic, noise, and cost of everything. My uncle had passed a few years earlier, and his land had been sitting untouched ever since. It wasn't huge, just a little over 15 acres of forested hillside with a stream cutting through the middle, but it was quiet, isolated, and nobody really went out there anymore. It felt like the kind of place where I could breathe again. I'd been planning it for months. The idea wasn't to make a perfect little vacation spot or some Instagram-ready tiny home. I just wanted something functional, a one-room shelter I could use for weekend getaways, maybe even stay for a month or two at a time. Something small, maybe 12 by 16 feet, just enough for a cot, a table, and a stove. I loaded up my old Tacoma with tools, supplies, food, water jugs, and a tarp, then drove the 6 hours out to the property on a Thursday morning. The plan was to spend about a week out there, build the shell of the cabin, and get back home by the next Friday. I brought everything I thought I might need: plywood, 2x4S, a chainsaw, hammer, nails, propane stove, a cooler full of ice and food, and a heavy-duty plastic storage box with a lock for anything I didn't want critters getting into. The drive wasn't bad, and by the time I pulled off the narrow dirt road that wound through the trees and up to the edge of the land, It was around 3 p.m. The sky had been cloudy all morning, but now it was starting to get darker, heavier. A storm was coming, but I figured I had enough time to pitch my tarp, unload, and prep the spot where I wanted to build. I parked about 20 yards into the tree line on a small flat clearing where my uncle used to park his camper. The spot was tucked away enough to not be visible from the old dirt road, but still flat enough for the foundation. The forest around me was mostly oak and pine, tall and tight, and the air had that heavy, earthy smell that always comes before a long rain. By nightfall, I had cleared the brush, marked the layout with stakes and string, and rigged the tarp between 4 trees just to cover my gear and give me a dry place to sleep. I didn't bring a tent, just a sleeping bag, a thick mat, and a waterproof bivy sack. I had done this kind of thing before and wasn't too worried. That first night, the rain started just after 2 a.m., a steady, cold sheet of it. I lay there listening to the tarp flapping above me, wind moving through the trees, and the crack of distant thunder. I slept light, not because I was afraid, but because I was thinking about everything I needed to do the next day. I woke early, maybe 5:30, still dark but starting to gray. The rain had slowed but hadn't stopped, and a thin mist hung in the trees. My boots were already damp from walking around, but I forced myself to ignore it. I boiled some water for coffee and started framing the foundation. The ground was soft and muddy, which made leveling the beams a pain. I had brought cinder blocks to support the corners and some gravel to help with drainage, but everything was slick. I slipped twice, once landing hard on my knee, and cursed myself for not waiting for better weather. Still, by mid-afternoon, I had the frame down and most of the floor joists in place. That night, the rain came down harder. It wasn't a storm anymore. It was just a cold, punishing downpour that lasted for hours without stopping. The kind of rain that soaks through jackets, drips down the back of your neck, and turns every inch of ground into sucking mud. My tarp sagged from the weight of the water, and I had to keep waking up to push it up with a stick so it wouldn't collapse. I barely slept. Sometime around 4 a.m., I heard something in the woods. I couldn't explain it. Not an animal exactly, not branches snapping. It sounded like footsteps, not fast, just careful. At first, I thought it might be a deer or a boar moving through the trees, but it didn't have that random movement that animals usually have. It was more like someone pacing. Slow steps, then a stop, then a few more, then nothing. I held my breath. My tarp rustled in the wind. The rain kept tapping above me, but the steps were gone. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe a tree creaking or a branch dropping. I was tired. Everything feels bigger and louder when you're alone in the woods at night. The next morning, I walked around the tree line just to be sure. I didn't see anything. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing out of place. I chalked it up to nerves and got back to work. That day, I got the subfloor finished and started framing the walls. My hands were numb from the cold. The rain hadn't let up, and even though I had work gloves, they were soaked through. I kept pushing. Every nail felt harder to drive. Every cut with the circular saw was slower and more difficult. By late afternoon, I had 2 walls up and braced. I ate a cold can of beans straight from the tin and tried to dry my socks by hanging them from a rope under the tarp. The firewood I had brought in a crate was too wet to burn, so I sat in my damp sleeping bag, shivering, just waiting for the night to pass. That night, I heard the steps again. Same sound, same rhythm, not close, not far, just steady. I sat up, holding my flashlight, listening. I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away where I was, but the footsteps, they stopped again. There was something about the way they stopped that felt off, like whoever or whatever was out there was listening for me. I stayed awake until dawn. On the 4th day, the fog rolled in. Thick, low, heavy fog that made everything past 20 feet look like milk. The woods felt different that day, quieter.
No birds. No rustling.
Just rain and fog and mud. I worked on the last 2 walls, nailing up the panels and cutting out space for a small window. I kept checking over my shoulder. Every 30 minutes or so, I'd stop and just listen. I didn't know what I was hoping to hear. Maybe nothing, maybe something. I started seeing things that didn't sit right with me. A crushed Red Bull can in the brush, not mine. A broken tree limb that looked like it had been stepped on. I hadn't seen that the day before. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat under the tarp, wrapped in my wet sleeping bag, holding the hatchet I'd been using to trim small branches. I kept the flashlight in my lap, but I didn't use it. The rain was lighter now, just a steady drizzle, but it made it harder to hear. At one point, I thought I saw a shape through the trees, just a dark figure standing behind the fog, maybe 30 or 40 feet back. But when I blinked, it was gone. I stared at that spot for an hour. Nothing moved. The 5th day, I worked faster. I got the roof panels on, at least enough to cover the frame. I didn't bother sealing anything. I just wanted it closed in. Something about the fog, the quiet, the sense that someone was around. I couldn't shake it. Late that afternoon, I saw the footprints, deep ones, in the soft mud behind the trees where I hadn't walked. Bigger than mine, wide set. Someone had been back there, circling the clearing. That was it for me. I packed my gear, threw everything in the truck in a rush, didn't bother organizing it. I left some of the wood behind, left the trash, left the leftover food and even the sleeping bag. I didn't care anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. As I backed out through the trees, I looked in the mirror. I saw someone step out from behind a tree, just for a second. A tall man in a dark coat, not running, not hiding, just standing there staring. I didn't stop. I drove until I hit the highway and didn't stop until I reached the nearest gas station 2 hours away. I sat in the lot for 20 minutes, hands shaking on the wheel. I never went back. The cabin's still there, or part of it probably, half-built and rotting in the rain. Whoever was watching me, they can have it. I haven't told many people this story, not because they wouldn't believe me, but because it doesn't matter if they do. I know what I heard, I know what I saw, and I know I'll never set foot in those woods again. Some places aren't meant to be built on, not because of ghosts, not because of legends, just because someone else is already there, and they don't want you around. It was late October 2019. I had just turned 33 a few weeks earlier and needed to get away from everything. Work had been draining me, and I had gone through a rough breakup in September that I still wasn't really over. I needed silence, no phones, no emails, no people, just nature. I planned a 3-day solo camping trip up in the northern part of Vermont, near the Canadian border, close to where my grandfather used to take me when I was a kid. It was all forests, dirt roads, and cold, clear rivers. The kind of place where you could hike for hours and never see a single person. I parked my car at a small gravel lot near a trailhead and started hiking in around noon. I had my pack, my tent, my food, and enough gear to last me comfortably for a few days. I knew the area well enough, had old paper maps too, just in case my GPS gave out. The weather was chilly but dry. Leaves were falling everywhere. The sky was overcast, and there was that cold, smoky smell in the air that only comes with late autumn. After hiking about 4 hours into the woods, far off the marked trails, I found a quiet, flat spot near a small stream and set up my tent. I made a little fire, ate some jerky and instant rice, and sat by the flames until the sun dropped behind the trees. It was peaceful. Just the soft trickle of water, rustling leaves, and the occasional bird or squirrel. The kind of quiet that wraps around your brain and lets you breathe again. The next morning, I decided to hike a little further north, leaving most of my gear behind except for my small day pack, a flashlight, water, a bit of food, and a knife I always carried. I wanted to explore deeper into the forest, maybe find that old logging road I remembered from years ago. The sun barely made it through the clouds, and the forest was damp and cold. My boots crunched on frost-covered leaves as I walked. After maybe 2 hours of hiking through denser and denser woods, I came across something I didn't expect, an old cabin. It was barely visible through the trees, set a little downhill from the ridge I was walking. The roof was sagging in the middle, part of the chimney had crumbled, and all the windows looked either broken or completely gone. The wood was dark and weathered, half covered in moss and vines. One side of the porch had collapsed entirely. It looked abandoned for decades, maybe longer. I stood there for a minute, just looking at it. It wasn't on any map I had, not even the old ones. And it didn't look like one of those vacation homes or hunting lodges you sometimes find up there. This place was old, like early 1900s old. Curiosity got the better of me. I knew I probably shouldn't go inside. I mean, the roof could collapse or there could be animals squatting in there, but I couldn't help it. I just wanted to take a quick look. I stepped carefully onto what was left of the porch, testing the wood before putting my full weight on it. My boots sank into the soft, damp boards, but they held. The front door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open gently, the hinges groaning. Inside, the air was thick, musty, and cold. It smelled like wet dirt, rotting wood, and something else I couldn't quite place. The light from outside barely made it through the broken windows, and everything inside was covered in dust and grime. A few pieces of furniture, an old wooden table, a collapsed cot, some shelves were scattered around, most of them broken. There was an old cast iron stove in the corner, rusted but still standing. I stepped inside slowly, flashlight in hand, watching every step. The floor creaked and sagged under my boots. There were dark stains on the walls and floorboards. Some looked like old water damage, but others, I don't know, they just didn't look right. Too dark, too soaked in. I walked into the back room and found what looked like a kitchen, or maybe a prep area. There was a sink, but no plumbing connected. Just a rusted basin, empty shelves, a broken chair on its side. Everything looked like it had been untouched for decades. I started to get this uneasy feeling in my chest. Not like something was watching me, not like some horror movie nonsense. Just this quiet, growing tension. Like I wasn't supposed to be there. Like the place was still holding on to something it didn't want to let go. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye near the corner of the room. A hatch in the floor, covered partially by a sheet of broken plywood. It wasn't big, maybe 2 feet by 2 feet, but it was definitely a door. I crouched down and brushed away the debris, revealing an old iron ring set into the wood. I gave it a tug. It resisted at first, then creaked open, revealing a steep, narrow set of wooden steps descending into total darkness. I hesitated. My gut told me not to go down there, but I had my flashlight, and the rational part of me said I was just exploring. It was probably a root cellar or some old storage space. Just a few steps down, a quick look, then out. The steps groaned under my weight as I descended. The air got colder and thicker with every foot I dropped. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing stone walls and dirt floors. There were shelves along the sides with rusted cans, old tools, and empty jars. Nothing unusual at first, just old junk left behind. Then I saw something on the far wall. A long wooden table, heavy, stained, and above it, hooks in the ceiling. Meat hooks, maybe? I wasn't sure. The metal was rusted, but the shape was unmistakable. Thick iron hooks, spaced evenly across a beam. On the floor beneath them were dark patches. Not water, something else. They looked like old bloodstains. A lot of them. I backed away slowly, my flashlight shaking a little now. Then I noticed something else. In the far right corner of the cellar, there was a set of wooden crates. One of them was broken open. Inside, beneath the splinters and debris, I saw bones. Not animal bones, human bones. I turned around and ran up the steps without even bothering to close the hatch behind me. I didn't care if I was loud. I just wanted out. I stepped back into the main room, heart pounding so loud I could barely hear my own footsteps. I moved toward the door. Then I heard something outside, a branch snapping. I froze. That didn't sound like an animal. It was slow, heavy, like a footstep. I crouched behind the broken table, heart hammering against my ribs. I peeked out the window. Nothing, just the trees. Then another sound, this time inside. A faint creak, like someone stepping on a loose floorboard in the hallway I had just walked through. I gripped the knife in my pocket but didn't move. My flashlight was still on, but I clicked it off, plunging everything into near darkness, just so I wouldn't give myself away. The creaking stopped. I waited, 5 minutes, maybe more. My legs started to cramp from crouching, but I didn't move. Then, slowly, I crawled to the door, got to my feet, and pushed it open as quietly as I could. The forest was silent again. Whatever had made the sound, maybe a deer, maybe nothing, was gone. Or hiding. I took off, walking fast at first, then jogging once I got farther from the cabin. I didn't stop until I was back at my tent. I sat down, caught my breath, and stayed up for the rest of the night, fire burning, eyes wide open. The next morning, I packed up everything and left. I didn't eat. I didn't take photos. I just hiked back to my car and drove home. For days, I told myself it was just some old hunter's cabin. Maybe the bones were from some ancient medical collection or something. Maybe the blood was from deer. The hooks maybe used for hanging game. But it didn't feel that way. That cellar wasn't for animals. Those bones weren't props. And the way everything was laid out, it felt deliberate. I tried reporting it anonymously to the local authorities. Told them I had stumbled across what looked like human remains in an abandoned structure, gave rough GPS coordinates, and left it at that. I didn't leave my name. I didn't want to get dragged into anything. I never heard anything back. No stories in the news. No follow-up. Nothing. But sometimes at night, I dream of that table. The hooks. The sound of that step creaking behind me when I thought I was alone. I haven't gone back to the woods since, and I never will. If I've learned anything, it's this: some places get forgotten for a reason, and some things buried in the woods were meant to stay buried. I was 35 when I decided to take a break from everything and spend a few days at a small hunting cabin in northern Wyoming, not far from the Bighorn National Forest. It was late October 2022, the kind of cold that creeps into your jacket even when the sun's still out. I'd been working nonstop for almost 2 years straight. My job in construction paid well, but it drained everything out of me. I hadn't taken time off in a while, and when a friend from high school, Eric, mentioned he had access to a cabin through his uncle, I asked if I could use it for a few days. He told me where the key was hidden and that I'd have the place to myself. The cabin wasn't much, just a plain wooden structure tucked into a patch of trees, surrounded by rolling hills, dead brush, and silence. It sat about 6 miles off the nearest gravel road. I had to drive my truck halfway up the trail and hike the rest when the path got too muddy. The elevation made it colder than I expected. My breath came out in clouds as I unlocked the cabin and stepped inside. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. There was one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom that didn't look like it had worked in years, and a living area with a couch that sagged in the middle. A wood stove sat against one wall with a pile of dry logs stacked beside it. There were no lights, just a few oil lamps and candles scattered around. No cell signal either. I wasn't surprised. That's what I wanted, honestly. No messages, no calls.
No noise.
Just me, my rifle, and whatever was out there in the trees. The first night was quiet. I set up my gear, unpacked my backpack, loaded my rifle, and cooked some food from the cans I brought. The silence was heavy. You don't really notice it until you sit in it for a while. No cars.
No voices.
Just wind and creaking wood and, sometimes, the distant rustle of something moving through the brush outside. I chalked it up to deer or maybe a fox. I went to bed early that night, stretched out in the narrow cot with my sleeping bag pulled tight around me. I kept the rifle close, not for any particular reason, just habit. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something tapping on the side of the cabin. Not hard, just a soft, repeated knock.
Top, top, top.
I sat up, still half asleep. It was dark, and I had to fumble for my flashlight. The tapping stopped. I waited. Nothing. I figured it was a branch in the wind. Maybe an animal. That's the problem with the woods, your brain fills in the gaps. I got up and checked around. I opened the door and shined the flashlight across the yard, into the trees. Nothing moved. The forest just sat there, heavy and black. I closed the door and went back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside with my gear and started moving toward a spot Eric told me about. A ridge where elk passed through sometimes. The trail was rough, but I moved slow, checking prints in the mud, watching for scat. I didn't see anything at first. No real signs of movement, but something felt off. The air was still, like the woods were holding their breath. Birds weren't singing. I didn't see squirrels darting around. Just quiet. I stayed out most of the day, sitting up on the ridge, scanning the brush. I thought I spotted movement once or twice, but never got a clear shot. As the sun dipped, I packed up and started heading back to the cabin. It was near dusk when I noticed the tracks. They weren't mine. I had come in from the north side of the ridge. These tracks came from the east and looked fresher than mine. Boots, large ones, bigger than mine by a size or two, deep impressions. Someone else had been out there. I stopped and crouched near them, checking the tread pattern, military style or something close. No sign of dragging, just clean walking strides. Whoever it was, they moved through the area sometime that day. I looked around, tried to listen, but all I could hear was the wind and the faint rustle of dry leaves. I followed the tracks for a few minutes before they veered downhill toward a dry creek bed. I didn't want to get caught out there after dark, so I turned back and made my way to the cabin. I locked the door that night. I didn't sleep well. Every creak in the floorboards, every pop from the stove made my skin crawl. Around midnight, I thought I heard footsteps outside, circling the cabin. Slow, measured steps. I didn't move. I just laid there, listening, my hand gripping the rifle under the covers. After maybe 5 minutes, the sound stopped. I stayed frozen for another hour before I drifted off. When I woke up, I walked around the cabin. I checked for tracks, but the wind had wiped the ground mostly clean. I found one thing though, a single boot print near the back of the cabin, just below the window. It matched the ones I saw by the ridge. I didn't have a good explanation. Maybe someone else was hunting out there. Maybe they saw the cabin and came to check it out. But something about it didn't sit right. If it was just a hunter, why walk around the cabin at midnight? Why tap on the walls? I stayed inside that day. I cleaned my rifle, cooked, kept checking the tree line through the windows. I didn't go back to the ridge. I didn't go anywhere. That night, I barely slept. I kept the oil lamp burning low and sat in the living room with the rifle on my lap. Around 3 a.m., I heard a sound that made my stomach knot. It was the doorknob turning, just a small click and turn. It didn't open, the door was locked, but someone was testing it, slow and careful. I didn't move. I just sat there, heart pounding, staring at the door. The handle rattled again, then silence. I waited. After maybe 10 minutes, I got up, crept to the door, and yanked it open, rifle raised. There was no one there. The yard was empty. Trees swayed gently in the breeze, their shadows long in the moonlight. I stepped out, barefoot, scanning the ground with the flashlight. The dirt had been disturbed. Faint prints. Someone had stood there, just outside the door. I followed them a few steps until they vanished into the brush. I didn't sleep after that. The next day, I decided to leave early. I packed my gear and hiked back to the truck. But when I got there, I saw something that made my stomach sink. The back window was smashed. At first, I thought maybe a branch had fallen on it, but there were no branches nearby, and the glass was pushed inward, not outward. Something or someone had broken into my truck. I checked inside. My map was gone. My spare keys were gone. The glove compartment had been rifled through, papers scattered across the seat. But nothing valuable was taken. Not the emergency cash, not the knife. Just the map, the spare keys, and a lighter I kept in the console. Whoever did it didn't care about stealing. They wanted information. I stood there in the cold for a long time, just trying to process it. Then I got in and started driving, glass crunching under my boots. I went straight to the sheriff's station in a nearby town called Dayton. I told them someone was messing around the cabin and had broken into my truck. They took a report, asked a few questions, and told me they'd look into it. But I could tell from the way the deputy talked that nothing would come of it. That area was remote.
No cameras.
No real patrols. If someone wanted to mess with you out there, there wasn't much anyone could do about it. I stayed in a cheap motel that night and drove back home to Colorado the next day. That should have been the end of it. But a week later, I got home from work and found something in my mailbox. It was a single sheet of paper folded neatly.
No envelope.
No return address. When I opened it, my chest tightened. It was the map I'd lost, my hand-drawn copy of the area around the cabin. But something had been added. In thick red marker, someone had circled the cabin and drawn a line from it to a spot on the ridge. Next to that spot, in red ink, were the words, "I saw you." That's when I realized that whoever had been out there wasn't just wandering. They were watching me the whole time. They knew where I was. They followed me without making a sound. They walked around the cabin, tried to get in, and when they couldn't, they waited. They watched. Then they followed me back to the truck. And even when I left, they weren't done. I moved a few months later, got rid of that truck, changed my number, stopped talking to Eric. I haven't gone hunting since, and I'll never set foot in that part of Wyoming again. It was late September of 2021 when I took a trip alone to a remote part of Northumberland, in the north of England. I'd been feeling overwhelmed with work and life in general, burnt out really, and wanted some space away from everything and everyone. I found this small off-grid cabin listed on a quiet rental site, run by an old couple who managed a few holiday lets in the region. It was advertised as a disconnected woodland escape. No Wi-Fi, no phone signal, no power except a solar-charged battery that powered a light or two and the water pump. That sounded perfect to me. The cabin sat about 1.5 miles from the nearest road, reachable only by foot through a winding dirt trail that cut through damp trees and small mossy clearings. I arrived by train at a small village and then took a cab as far as it would go before I had to walk the rest of the way. I was 32 then, fairly fit, lived in Sheffield, worked from home as a freelance editor, and wasn't some thrill-seeking hiker or camper. I just wanted peace. That was the only thing I thought I was signing up for. The cabin was a small wooden thing, 1 room and a compost toilet in a separate outhouse 20 feet away. A tiny potbelly stove heated the place, and there was a little iron kettle and some pans. A narrow bed was tucked against the far wall beside a dusty window that overlooked nothing but dense forest. Everything smelled like old pine and wet bark, but I didn't mind. I lit a fire and unpacked. It was already getting dark by the time I settled in. The first night was uneventful, cold but manageable. I'd brought books, a couple of notebooks, and some food supplies for the week. I drank some tea, sat by the fire, and listened to the woods. The forest was strangely quiet at night. No owls, no whine through the trees, just the stillness that you don't get in cities. It was peaceful, even if it felt a little unnatural at times. The second day, I explored a bit. I followed a path beyond the cabin that looped around a small stream and climbed slightly uphill. From there, I could barely make out a clearing where the trees thinned a little. Beyond that, nothing but forest and sky. I saw no houses, no signs of life, no trails. It felt like I'd stepped into some forgotten patch of the country. Just damp earth, rustling leaves, and old trunks that groaned in the breeze. That evening, while collecting dry twigs for the stove, I thought I saw movement deeper in the woods, something between the trees, a flicker of dark clothing or a shadow. I stood still, trying to listen, but I heard nothing. I figured it was a deer or maybe my imagination. Light plays tricks when the sun sets behind the trees, but something about it sat wrong with me. By the third day, I had this gnawing sense that I wasn't completely alone. I started noticing small changes that made no sense. Like the woods felt quieter than usual, if that was even possible. And the trail that circled the cabin, just a narrow track worn into the leaves by past visitors, looked a bit disturbed. Leaves pushed aside in patches that looked fresh. Once, I found what looked like the heel of a boot print near the outhouse. It was small and narrow, not mine. I brushed it off. Could have been old. Could have been mine from earlier. I wasn't sure. That night, I couldn't sleep properly. I brought earplugs, but didn't use them. I wanted to hear if anything was moving outside. Around 2 a.m., I heard something crunching through the leaves, just behind the back of the cabin. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, trying not to breathe too loudly. It didn't sound like an animal. It was slow. One step, then nothing, then another. I waited there in the dark, holding my breath. I couldn't see anything through the back window. It was too dark, but the sound didn't come closer. After a few minutes, it stopped. The next morning, I walked the area around the back of the cabin, trying to find any trace. I saw a couple of bent sticks and a patch of flattened moss, but that was it. I told myself it could have been anything. I was on edge, though. I didn't feel safe anymore. That afternoon, while sitting out on the small porch steps drinking tea, I finally saw her. She was maybe 100 feet away, standing still between two trees across from the clearing near the trail I'd walked the day before. Pale face, thin arms, dark clothes, couldn't tell exactly what, maybe a long coat or dress. Her hair was dark and hung straight down, like it hadn't been washed in a long time. She was just there, not moving, not hiding, not approaching, just watching. I stared back. My whole body froze. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to run inside and make it look like I was afraid. I also didn't want to keep sitting there like nothing was wrong. After a minute, I stood up slowly and went inside. I looked through the window. She was gone. I stayed inside the rest of that day. I kept checking the windows, kept listening. I didn't see her again, but I felt watched, like I couldn't relax, even for a second. My mind started spiraling. Was she local? Did she live somewhere nearby? But how? I'd seen no other homes, no paths. Was she camping out here? But why would she just stand there like that, not saying anything, not moving? That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the fire low and the lights off. Around 1 a.m., I heard something again. This time, footsteps right outside the front porch. I didn't dare move. My bag was near the door, and I had a small knife in it I'd brought for cooking, but I couldn't get to it without making noise. I just lay there, rigid, ears straining. Then the footsteps circled the cabin. They moved around the side, toward the outhouse, then toward the back. Slow, deliberate steps. Every few seconds, a pause like whoever it was stopping to listen. I felt trapped. There was no signal, no way to call anyone, no one within miles. I didn't know what she wanted. I didn't know if she had a weapon or was just trying to scare me. Eventually, the footsteps faded into the woods again. The next morning, I wanted to leave. I packed up, but remembered I had to walk more than a mile back to the road. I didn't want to run into her out there. I decided to wait until midday, thinking if she was still out there, maybe she'd be sleeping or gone. I stayed inside, clutching the small kitchen knife like it would make a difference. At around noon, I stepped outside. I made sure I had everything in my pack and took one last look around the cabin. That's when I saw it. Near the trail, just beyond the clearing, were faint boot prints in the soft dirt, smaller than mine. One of them pointed straight toward the cabin. The other was angled sideways like someone had been standing there, waiting. I walked fast down the trail. Didn't run, but didn't stop. Every sound behind me made my skin crawl. Every time a branch cracked, I flinched. It took me about 25 minutes to reach the edge of the road. I never looked back until I got to the village. I went to the nearest cafe and asked to use their phone. I called the couple who owned the cabin and told them something felt wrong out there, that someone might be hanging around. The man on the phone didn't seem surprised. He just said, "All right, we'll look into it." That was it. I never went back. Weeks later, I tried to look up reports from that area. Nothing. No missing people, no arrests, no break-ins. I even looked through local forums to see if anyone else had seen strange things in those woods. Nothing. But I know what I saw. She wasn't a ghost. She wasn't a hallucination. She was real. A real woman, standing in the woods, watching a stranger's cabin, walking around it at night. I've thought about her a lot since then, who she was, what she wanted. Maybe she lived rough out there. Maybe she had some mental illness and wandered the woods. Or maybe she just liked scaring people. But something in my gut tells me it wasn't just random. She chose to be there. She wanted to be seen. And then she vanished just as easily. I still wake up some nights thinking I hear those slow steps outside my window. I moved flats after that and never went into the woods again. I stay in hotels now, places with locks, other people nearby, and walls that aren't paper thin. That trip was supposed to help me clear my head, but all it did was put something in there I'll never shake. The cabin's still listed online, still up for rent. Same photos, same description, disconnected woodland escape. I wonder who's staying there now. I wonder if they've seen her, and I wonder if she's still out there, standing between the trees, waiting for someone else to come alone. My name is Curtis. Back in the fall of 2013, I was 42 years old and living alone in Rockford, Illinois. I'd worked for nearly 20 years as a maintenance tech at a food packaging plant, and I finally had enough saved up to buy something I'd always wanted. A small cabin tucked somewhere quiet, far from town, far from noise, and definitely far from people. I found one through a guy I met at a trade show in southern Missouri. He mentioned his cousin was selling a small off-grid cabin up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, near a little town called Baraga. It wasn't anything fancy, just 4 walls, a roof, a wood stove, and a water tank. No electricity, no cell signal, no running water unless you pumped it from the well outside. I liked that. I wanted simple. I wanted to get away for a few weeks at a time when I could. Just me, some firewood, and maybe my old dog, Ray. That October, I took 3 weeks off work. I loaded up the bed of my 2001 Ford Ranger with food, propane tanks, tools, and enough firewood to keep the stove going for a good while. Ray sat up front with me, his gray face looking out the window like he knew we were heading somewhere special. The drive took about 9 hours. By the time I turned off the last paved road and onto the long dirt trail that led into the woods, the sun was getting low, and the trees were casting long shadows across the windshield. I could tell we were deep into the sticks. That last stretch was maybe 8 or 9 miles of nothing but gravel, overgrown brush, and the occasional rusted mailbox without a house in sight. Once I saw the cabin, I knew it was perfect. It looked just like the photos, small, quiet, no neighbors, just a clearing, a shed, and the start of the woods on all sides. I unpacked, lit the stove, and sat on the front step with Ray as the sun dropped behind the trees. The only sound was the crackling fire and the occasional rustle in the woods. No cars.
No sirens. No TVs.
Felt right. The first few days went just like I'd hoped. I split wood, cooked on the camp stove, and took long walks down the old logging paths nearby. Sometimes I'd take Ray with me, sometimes I'd leave him to nap by the fire. The nights got cold, but that little wood stove worked like a charm. I slept on a simple cot in a sleeping bag, and I always kept my .38 revolver close, just in case I ran into a bear or something worse. Around day 5, I noticed something weird. I was out walking one of the longer trails that looped back behind the ridge to the west. It curved down toward a stream that fed into a small pond maybe 2 miles out. I'd been there once before with Ray. This time I noticed tracks, boot prints, fresh ones. They weren't mine. I knew that for sure because I hadn't worn that kind of sole. These were heavier, deeper, looked like maybe steel-toe boots. At first, I figured it was a hunter or a hiker. Even that far out, someone could have wandered through. But then I noticed how the tracks circled the pond and then doubled back toward my cabin. I followed them about halfway, but I stopped. Something about it didn't sit right. I turned around and walked back home, checking behind me more often than usual. That night, I stayed inside. I cooked dinner, kept the stove going, and sat with Ray by the fire. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, that maybe they knew I was here alone. I checked the locks on the cabin. The front door had a deadbolt. The back was just a latch. I braced a chair under it. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to Ray growling. Low, steady growl. His ears were perked, and he was staring at the back door. I didn't hear anything at first, but I sat up and stayed still. Then I heard it, a soft crunch of leaves, slow footsteps, just 1 or 2, then silence. I grabbed the revolver and stood next to the stove. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. Ray didn't stop growling, not until almost dawn. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I walked the perimeter. I found prints again, in the soft earth by the back door. Same boot marks. They hadn't come from the trail. They came from the woods, deep woods. There were no tire tracks, no signs of a campsite nearby. Whoever it was had come on foot, and they were close enough to stand behind my cabin while I was asleep. I thought about leaving that day, packing up and heading out, but I told myself maybe it was just a drifter or some hunter passing through. I didn't want to overreact. I stayed. The next 3 days were quiet, too quiet. No more tracks, no more sounds in the night, but the air felt different, heavier. I started to feel like I was being watched whenever I stepped outside. I'd go to grab water from the well and feel eyes on me. I'd walk Ray and notice him sniffing at the air like something wasn't right. Then on the 10th night, things went bad. It was cold that evening, colder than any night so far. I loaded the stove up heavy and planned to stay inside. Around 11 p.m., the fire started to die down. I got up to add more wood, and that's when I noticed the back window. It was open, just cracked, maybe 3 inches, but I hadn't opened it. I never opened that one. I kept it locked because it didn't close right. I froze. I looked at Ray. He was standing now, ears up, hackles raised.
No growling.
just silent, alert. I turned off the lamp and stood in the dark. My eyes adjusted slowly. I stepped toward the window and closed it, sliding the latch down. That's when I heard something from the shed. It was about 40 feet from the cabin. Old, rotting wood with a padlock I'd put on myself when I arrived. I kept tools in there. I hadn't opened it in days. Something was inside, not just wind or an animal. I heard metal scraping, then a soft thud, then silence. I didn't want to go out there. Every part of me said to stay inside, but I couldn't just ignore it. I threw on my boots and coat, grabbed the flashlight and the revolver, and walked outside. The shed door was shut, the padlock still there. I stood in front of it for a full minute, listening. Nothing. I stepped closer. Just as I reached out, I heard it again. A single thud from inside. Something heavy moving. I stepped back. I aimed the flashlight at the padlock. Still sealed. I stepped around the side of the shed to check the back. That's when I saw it. A hole. Someone had broken through the rear wall. A panel of the old wood was pulled away, just wide enough for someone to crawl through. That was enough. I didn't look inside. I ran back to the cabin, slammed the door, locked everything, and pushed the kitchen table in front of it. Ray barked once, then just stared at me. I sat with the revolver in my lap until sunrise. The next morning, I went to check the shed again. The hole in the back was still there, but inside, the place was a mess. Tools knocked over. My backup fuel tank was gone. And in the dirt near the hole, I saw a blanket. A dirty old military-style blanket. Someone had been sleeping in there, watching me, maybe for days. I packed up. I didn't care about the food, the firewood, anything. I got Ray in the truck, locked the cabin, and drove down that gravel road faster than I should have. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. I called the sheriff's office from a diner 30 miles out, told them what I saw, gave them directions. They said they'd check it out. I never went back. A few weeks later, I got a call from a deputy. He said they found signs that someone had been squatting in the woods near the cabin. Old food wrappers, empty cans, and footprints that led right up to the window I'd found open. But no person, whoever it was, had vanished. They asked if I wanted to press charges if they ever found him. I said no. I just wanted to forget it. I sold the cabin that spring, lost money on it, but I didn't care. Some things aren't worth the peace you lose. I still think about it sometimes, usually when I'm out walking Ray, or when I hear noises at night. Whoever that was, they knew I was alone. They knew I didn't expect company, and they waited. I don't go into the woods alone anymore, not even for a walk, not even for a minute, because the scariest part wasn't that someone had been near my cabin. It was how careful they were, how quiet, how long they must have watched me, and how they never said a word. It was late October 2017 when I went back to the old cabin near the cemetery. I hadn't been there in almost 10 years, not since my uncle passed away and we stopped visiting the land altogether. It sat at the edge of a large private plot in rural Tennessee, close to a tiny overgrown graveyard that probably hadn't seen a fresh burial in 50 years. I was 35 that fall, and for some reason, I got it into my head that I needed a quiet place to stay for a weekend away from Nashville. I remembered the cabin being peaceful when I was a kid. My Uncle Gerald used to take me there when I was a teenager. He always said it was the only place he felt truly off the grid. It wasn't listed on any map anymore, and even the dirt road that used to lead to it had mostly faded away under weeds and gravel. I had to park my truck off an old logging path and hike the last mile with my pack and gear. I brought everything I'd need: water jugs, propane for the little stove inside, dried food, and my sleeping bag. I hadn't told anyone where I was going, which in hindsight was stupid, but I figured I'd be back by Monday anyway. I just wanted the kind of silence you can only get way out in the middle of nowhere. No phones, no people, no work. The cabin was still there. The roof had held up surprisingly well, though the front steps were rotting and the porch sagged slightly in one corner. Ivy had crept up the left side of the building, and a few broken branches leaned against the outer walls. I didn't notice any real damage beyond cosmetic decay. The windows were intact, though clouded with grime. One of the shutters had fallen off. It smelled of old wood, damp dirt, and the kind of dry, flaky dust that comes from sitting untouched for years. Inside, it was as I remembered, one main room with a small wood stove, a rickety table, and 2 cots along the walls. In the back was a small kitchen setup with a cracked sink basin, and behind that, a dry latrine stall built into the corner. No plumbing, of course, and the generator that used to sit out back was long gone. I set up my things, cleared the floor of rodent droppings and leaves, then unpacked my sleeping gear. By late afternoon, I had the place more or less livable. I made a simple dinner and sat out on the porch in a lawn chair I'd carried with me. From there, I could see the graveyard down the slope, maybe 200 yards away. It was ringed with old wrought iron fencing, crooked and rusted in places. Some of the headstones were barely sticking up above the grass. Others had toppled over completely. I remembered it being spookier as a kid, but in the orange light of the sunset, it looked more like history than horror. The first night passed without issue. It got cold quickly after the sun went down, and I kept the little wood stove going until after midnight. I stayed up later than I should have, reading an old hunting magazine I found in one of the drawers, and drinking from a flask I brought with me. The wind picked up just before I fell asleep, and I could hear it brushing the tree branches against the roof. The next morning, I woke up around 7. The air was cold and the windows were fogged up. I made instant coffee and ate some granola. I stepped outside to stretch, and when I looked down the hill toward the graveyard, I saw something strange. A small metal shovel was leaning against the fence. It hadn't been there the night before. I remembered walking the edge of the graveyard briefly before sunset and hadn't noticed anything like that. It looked fairly new. Not brand new, but not like something from the 1950s either. At first I thought maybe it was something I'd missed, or a tool someone had left behind years ago and just recently got uncovered. But it didn't make sense how it was standing, leaning upright like it had been placed there deliberately. I figured maybe some local had passed through and left it there. I didn't think much more about it. That day I walked the property. I brought my old .22 rifle with me just in case I ran into any animals, but I never saw anything more than some squirrels and a group of wild turkeys. I followed the edge of the ravine behind the cabin, checked out the dry creek bed, and even walked beyond the fence line for a while to where the woods thickened. I didn't see any footprints or signs of other people. The forest floor was covered in dry leaves and pine needles, and it didn't look like anyone had come through in a while. When I got back later that afternoon, the shovel was gone. I stood at the edge of the hill staring at the fence. I walked down to the graveyard, stepped through the old gate, and looked around carefully. Nothing had been moved. The shovel was just gone. I felt a tightness in my chest I couldn't explain. The kind of unease that creeps up on you slowly, not because something terrible happened, but because something small didn't make sense. That night, I locked the front door with the sliding bolt and wedged a chair under the handle. There weren't any real threats out here, no bears, no big predators. But I kept the rifle loaded beside my cot anyway. I barely slept. Every time the wind shifted or the cabin creaked, I opened my eyes. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard faint footsteps outside. Not heavy, just enough to sound like someone was walking slowly through the leaves around the back of the cabin. I didn't get up. I just laid there holding my breath, listening. The sound faded after a few seconds, and I convinced myself it was maybe a deer or a raccoon. When I finally did fall asleep again, it was morning before I woke. Day 3, I decided to leave early. I packed up most of my gear and planned to head out before nightfall. but something nagged at me. I kept thinking about that shovel. I wanted to check the graveyard one more time. Around noon, I walked down again. I spent 20 minutes combing through the headstones, reading names, wiping off the moss, even checking behind the large oak in the corner of the fence line. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. One of the graves looked disturbed. It was subtle. The leaves had been cleared from a rectangle of ground. The dirt looked slightly darker, as if it had been turned recently. But the headstone beside it was crooked, and when I looked closer, I saw fresh scuff marks in the soil, boot prints. Maybe 3 or 4, like someone had stood there, facing the grave. I crouched and felt the ground. It was packed firm, not soft like it had just been dug, but definitely not as hard as the ground around it. I realized I didn't want to be there anymore. I stood up, walked fast back up the slope, locked the cabin door behind me, and tried to stay calm. My nerves were frayed. I kept hearing things. I kept expecting to see someone standing in the trees, watching. I decided to leave that evening. I didn't care about hiking in the dark. I just wanted to get back to the truck and sleep in my own bed. I strapped my pack, got everything ready, then took one last look through the windows, and I saw a man standing inside the graveyard. He wasn't doing anything, just standing near the disturbed grave, wearing dark pants and a tan coat. He was facing away from me, toward the headstone. I backed away from the window and didn't move. I waited maybe 10 minutes, then peeked again. He was gone. That was it for me. I opened the door, stepped outside with the rifle in one hand and my bag over my shoulder, and started moving. Fast. I made it down the logging path, never looking back, and didn't stop until I saw the shine of my truck under the trees. I threw my gear into the bed, got behind the wheel, and started the engine. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Over the next few weeks, I kept thinking about that grave, about the shovel, about the sound of footsteps. I even thought about calling the local sheriff's office, but what was I going to say? Hey, there's a shovel that disappeared, and a grave that maybe looks slightly messed up, and a guy standing in a place where I don't live? I let it go, mostly. But then in mid-November, I looked up the name on the headstone. I remembered it, Ruth Chandler, 1919, 1993 ***. I typed it into a public obituary search online. She had been murdered in a farmhouse not far from the cabin. Her son was arrested for it, served 15 years, then released in 2011. No one knew where he'd gone after that. That cabin used to belong to him. My uncle bought it in '94 after the guy went to prison. That's why it was so cheap. He never told me where it came from, and I never thought to ask. Clicked for me slowly and sickeningly. The man I saw wasn't a stranger. He was him, the son, back at the grave, years later, and I'd been staying in his cabin, sleeping in the same place he once called home. Maybe he never meant to hurt me. Maybe he just wanted to see his mother's grave again. Or maybe I got lucky by leaving when I did. I never went back. I never will. In the summer of 2012, I was 34 years old and going through a rough patch. I had just left my job at a logistics company in Seattle after some disagreements with upper management, and my long-term relationship had ended a few months earlier. I was tired, burnt out, and just needed a place to be alone for a while. My cousin Jesse had this old hunting cabin near Granite Falls that he barely used anymore. It was small, simple, no plumbing, no power, just wood, nails, and a roof. He offered to let me stay there for a while to clear my head. I said yes without thinking much about it. It was deep in the woods, surrounded by thick trees and steep hills. There was a gravel road that curved down through the trees for about 3 miles after the last paved road. After that, it was just forest. You couldn't see another house, not even a light through the trees at night. The cabin was next to a small stream that you could hear trickling if the wind wasn't blowing. Jesse had left a few basics inside: a gas lantern, a stack of chopped firewood, and a couple of old cots. I brought in food, water, a small camping stove, a shotgun just in case, and my dog, Bear, a big black mutt with some Labrador in him. Bear was the only living thing I really trusted at that time. I'd had him for 7 years, rescued him from a shelter when he was barely a year old. He'd been with me through all the messy parts of my life. He was calm, alert, and didn't bark unless there was a good reason. He slept light, ears twitching at every branch snap or leaf rustle. The first few days in the cabin were peaceful. I spent my time cutting wood, going on hikes with Bear, cooking simple meals, and reading old books Jesse had left behind. The silence of the woods was new to me. At night, the sounds were different than the city. No cars, no sirens, just the occasional whine through the trees, an owl hooting in the distance, and sometimes small things moving in the underbrush. I tried not to spook myself by overthinking those noises, but things changed around the fourth night. It had rained during the afternoon, and the woods were damp and quiet. Around dusk, I lit the gas lantern and sat in the cabin on a folding chair, watching the fire crackle in the wood stove. Bear was curled up near my feet, half asleep. I remember how peaceful it felt in that moment. Then, he suddenly stood up, rigid, ears perked. He was looking toward the door. I didn't hear anything at first, just the faint patter of dripping water from the trees. But Bear stayed locked on the door like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. I turned off the lantern and stood beside him, hand on the shotgun leaning against the wall. The fire threw shadows on the log walls. I waited, still nothing. Then I heard it. Faint footsteps outside. Not an animal. Something bipedal. Deliberate. There was no reason for anyone to be out there.
No hikers, no campers.
The nearest neighbor was at least 4 miles away, and Jesse said nobody came through those woods anymore. I crouched low and listened hard. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin. I held my breath. Bear growled low in his throat. That sound he made wasn't fear, it was a warning. I slowly lifted the shotgun and waited. My heart thudded in my ears. Then nothing. Just the dripping of rain from the trees and Bear breathing heavy beside me. I waited for almost an hour, not daring to make a sound. No more footsteps. Finally, I turned the lantern back on and stayed up all night, just watching the door. Bear never left his post beside it. The next morning, I walked a wide circle around the cabin, checking the ground. The wet soil showed boot prints, not mine. I followed them for a while, but they disappeared into some rocky ground. That was the first time I truly felt unsafe out there. I thought about leaving that day, packing up and driving back to the city. But something in me didn't want to run. I don't know if it was pride or just stubbornness. I told myself it was probably a hiker who got lost or turned around in the woods. Maybe they saw the cabin light and came to check it out. Still, I made sure to keep the shotgun loaded and leaned against the wall beside my sleeping bag every night after that. That night, nothing happened. But the next 2 days were different. I started noticing little things around the cabin. Nothing big, just small signs that something wasn't right. A small stack of firewood I'd made was knocked over in the night. A nail had been pulled halfway out of the door frame. Once, I came back from a hike with Bear to find the cabin door slightly open. I knew I had locked it. Each time I tried to explain it away. Maybe I hadn't shut the door properly. Maybe an animal knocked over the woodpile. Maybe that nail had already been loose. But Bear knew better. He started sleeping beside the door every night, growling at nothing. I stopped leaving the cabin after dark. I even covered the windows with blankets so no light would leak outside. Then, one evening, I found something that made my skin crawl. I was out collecting dry branches for kindling when I saw it. A tree maybe 30 yards from the cabin, had a rope nailed to it about shoulder height. At the end of the rope was a crude loop like a noose. It wasn't old. The rope looked recently cut and tied. The nail was clean, not rusted. I didn't touch it. I just backed away and walked straight back to the cabin with Bear right behind me. That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat in the dark with the shotgun across my lap, listening. The fire in the stove burned down to embers. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps. Not fast, not careless, just steady and close. Then I heard something else, metal scraping against wood. Came from the back of the cabin. I moved slowly to the rear window and lifted the blanket a bit. There was someone out there, a man. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could make out the shape of his body in the faint light of the moon. He was wearing dark clothes and crouched low near the wall. He had something in his hand. I think it was a small crowbar or maybe a tire iron. He was trying to pry something loose from the wall. I didn't shout. I didn't move. I just crouched there watching him. Bear was beside me, baring his teeth. After a while, the man gave up and slipped into the trees. I didn't chase him. I didn't want to find out what he'd do if cornered. When the sun rose, I walked around to the back of the cabin. There were deep scratches on the logs near the bottom corner. Someone had been trying to pry apart the wall. I packed my things that morning. I didn't care about staying another night. I hiked back to the truck with Bear, loaded everything up, and drove until I reached the nearest gas station with a phone. I didn't have cell service out there. I called Jesse and told him what had happened. He didn't seem surprised. Said he'd heard of strange things going on in those woods years ago. He hadn't told me because he thought the stories were just old rumors. Something about squatters living off-grid in the forest and occasionally messing with cabins. I never went back. That shotgun sits in my closet to this day, never fired. Bear passed away a couple years later, old age finally catching up to him. He saved my life that week. I know it. If I hadn't had him with me, maybe I would have brushed off the sounds. Maybe I would have walked out to investigate that noise. Maybe I would have opened that door when I shouldn't have. I still think about that man in the woods. I never saw his face. Never knew why he came back night after night. He never said a word. Never broke in. Just watched. Waited. Tried to break through the walls of that little cabin one night at a time. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was just a man. A real man. And sometimes that's way worse. It was late October 2022 when I finally went back to the cabin. My name's Tyler Grant. I'm 41 now, originally from outside Helena, Montana. I'd been living in Missoula the last few years, working construction and doing odd jobs on the side. My ex-wife, Dana, had passed away that summer. She died from a brain aneurysm. It happened fast. I hadn't seen her much in the last couple years, maybe once at a mutual friend's barbecue, but we were still tied together by one thing: the cabin. The place sat about an hour and a half north of Missoula, near a small town called Ovando, off a dirt road that twisted through the hills and pine. It was remote, no neighbors for miles, no phone reception unless you hiked halfway up the ridge behind it. We bought it together back in 2010 when we were still married. We used it on weekends, holidays, for fishing trips, and sometimes just to get away from the world. After the divorce in 2017, Dana got the place in the settlement. I didn't fight her on it. I thought I was done with that part of my life. But after she died, I got a letter from her lawyer. She had left the cabin to me. That's how I ended up sitting behind the wheel of my old Silverado, tires kicking up gravel on a cold, gray afternoon, heading into those woods again. I didn't know what I expected to feel. Maybe guilt, maybe regret, maybe nothing. But I wasn't going there for closure. I was going to see what was left of the place, to figure out if I'd keep it or sell it off. The last 5 miles of the drive were rough. deep ruts in the road, overgrown branches scraping along the sides of the truck. I hadn't realized how long it had been since anyone drove that route. The cabin didn't have any real driveway, just a clearing with a rusted metal gate you had to open by hand. I parked the truck just outside it, got out and pulled the gate open. The wind was cold, sharp, the kind that cuts through your jacket. Pine needles covered everything. It smelled like wet bark and old leaves. When I finally saw the cabin through the trees, it looked smaller than I remembered. More worn. The roof had a couple dark patches, probably leaks. One of the gutters had fallen off. The steps leading up to the porch were sagging. I didn't feel anything at first. No memories hit me, no flood of emotion. I just felt like I was looking at an old shed I used to rent tools from. Inside was worse. The door creaked when I opened it. Not in a haunted house way, just in a nobody's greased the hinges in years way. It smelled musty, the kind of thick, stale air that fills a place after it's been closed up for too long. A mix of damp wood, dust, and something else. Something like decay, faint but noticeable. There were still a few things inside. An old couch with a sheet over it. A wooden table with 2 chairs. The wood stove sat in the corner, the same one we used to feed pine logs into on snowy nights. A couple empty picture frames still hung on the walls. The fridge was unplugged, left open with a dish towel shoved inside it to keep it from molding up. In the bedroom, I found a few of Dana's things. A faded fleece blanket, a pair of boots under the bed, and a small box on the nightstand. It had some of her old jewelry in it. Nothing fancy, just stuff she used to wear every day. I didn't touch any of it, just closed the lid and left it there. I decided to stay one night, just one. I brought a sleeping bag, a camping stove, a flashlight, and a couple cans of chili. The place had no power, and I wasn't sure the propane line still worked, so I didn't mess with the kitchen. I used my lantern and kept my gear on the floor in the main room. By 7 p.m., it was already pitch black outside. The sky had gone from overcast gray to a thick black curtain, the kind you only get way out in the woods, away from towns and traffic lights. The wind had picked up. You could hear it running through the trees, branches swaying and knocking into each other. Occasionally, one would snap. I wasn't scared, but I didn't feel comfortable either. The cabin creaked a lot, the kind of slow, groaning sounds that come from a structure shifting in the cold. I knew that rationally. I told myself that 100 times as I lay there in the dark with my boots still on. But then came something I couldn't quite shake. Around 10 p.m., I heard footsteps. Not cabin creaks, not wind. Footsteps. They were slow, heavy, crunching pine needles, right outside the cabin, just past the window near the door. They walked from one side of the cabin to the other, then stopped. I stayed still, didn't move, just listened. After about a minute, I got up, turned off my lantern, and crept to the window. I pressed my back against the wall and slowly peeked out. Nothing, just trees and darkness. But I knew what I heard. It wasn't a bear or a deer. Those sound different. I've lived in Montana long enough to know the difference between animal sounds and a person's boots crunching forest floor. I sat back down, this time with my flashlight in one hand and my hunting knife in the other. I didn't sleep, just stared at the front door until the sun came up. When morning finally arrived, I walked outside. The cold hit hard, and I could still see my breath. I walked around the cabin slowly, scanning the ground. That's when I found them. Tracks, footprints, human, a single set walking along the side of the cabin. They weren't mine. They came from the woods, walked up the side, and stopped near the back window, then turned and walked off toward the trees again. I followed them for a while. They were faint, but I could see them. They led into the trees, then vanished about 20 yards out where the ground turned rocky. There weren't any tire tracks or bike prints. Whoever it was had walked here, No backpack prints either. No animal dragged. Just someone walking right up to the cabin in the dead of night and then walking off. I packed up my things and locked the cabin. I didn't stay another night. On the drive back, I kept going over it in my head. Could have been a hunter, maybe some drifter, but who walks through the woods at night with no light? Who stands outside a stranger's cabin and then leaves without a sound? When I got back to Missoula, I called the local sheriff's office and filed a report. Not much they could do. No damage, no theft, just some strange footprints. Still, it stayed with me. A week later, I decided to drive back, this time during the day, to set up trail cams. I bought 3 from a sporting goods store, 1 for the front porch, 1 for the back of the cabin, and 1 facing the tree line where those prints had gone. I left them there for 2 weeks. When I went back to collect them, I found something even stranger. 2 of the cameras were untouched, but the third, the one facing the woods, was gone. Not ripped off, not broken, gone. The strap had been cut clean like with a knife. The base was still there, but the camera itself was missing. I checked the other 2. One of them had a handful of clips, deer, birds, even a fox. But at 2:41 a.m. one night, the porch cam recorded a blurry figure, just a shape, someone tall, broad-shouldered, walking toward the cabin.
No flashlight, no headlamp.
They stopped just before the door and stood there for nearly 30 seconds. Then they turned and walked away. That was it. No face, no details, just a shadowy figure in the night. That same night, the forest-facing cam went dark. I still have that clip. I've shown it to friends. Some say it's just a trick of the light. Some say it's a bear. But they're wrong. It's not an animal. I don't know what it was doing out there or why it came back more than once, but I know it wasn't random. That place, our old cabin, it had always felt isolated, but never unsafe. After Dana died, something changed. Maybe it was always there and I just didn't notice. Or maybe someone found it while it sat empty those few months. I ended up selling the place that winter. Got less than it was worth, but I didn't care. I didn't want to go back. Didn't even want to think about it. I kept Dana's box, her old jewelry. I don't know why. Maybe because it was one of the last things left untouched in that place. Maybe because it reminded me of when the cabin felt like home, before everything got heavy and strange. I still think about the footsteps sometimes, about the missing camera, about that figure on the porch. I'll never know who it was or what they wanted, but I know this much. Whoever they were, they weren't passing through. They knew the cabin was there, and they waited until it was alone again. It was late October of 2017 when I decided to finally take a break from everything. I was 34 at the time, living in a small town in Idaho called Grangeville. Life had been a mess for the last few months. I was burnt out from work, dealing with the leftover mess from a messy divorce, and just mentally drained. I needed quiet. I needed space. I needed something away from screens, people, and noise. That's why I packed up my truck, loaded up my dog Murphy, and headed toward a small hunting cabin my uncle had left me a few years back near a place called Tanner's Ridge, about 2 hours north in a forested area near the edge of Clearwater National Forest. Murphy was a 5-year-old black lab, always calm but alert. He was the only living thing I could stand being around during that time. I trusted him more than most people I knew. The cabin wasn't much. It was old, tucked away down a dirt trail most people didn't even know existed. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, some kerosene lamps, a small outhouse, and a roof that mostly held up in rain. It had one room with a bunk bed on one wall and a counter on the other with an old propane stove I wasn't sure still worked. A table in the middle, a few broken chairs. It sat about 100 yards off a creek, surrounded by thick forest on all sides. The first day was peaceful. The air was cold and crisp, with leaves covering the ground in layers. I walked the area with Murphy, checking the perimeter and paths, making sure no trees had fallen over the trail in or out. I had brought in enough supplies for a week: dried food, bottled water, firewood, matches, and my old bolt-action rifle just in case I ran into a bear or something else bigger than I wanted to deal with. At night, the wind picked up hard. The trees creaked. The roof moaned sometimes like old houses do. I sat by the wood stove with Murphy curled at my feet, just staring at the fire until I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. The silence was thick out there, not like city silence, but the kind where every sound you do hear feels sharper, closer. I remember how much I liked it at first. The next few days were mostly the same. I cut some wood, walked the trails, cooked simple food on the stove. I even managed to sleep better than I had in months. I kept my phone off the entire time. No one knew I was out there except my cousin James, who had the general location in case something went wrong. It was on the fourth night when things started to change. It was just past midnight when Murphy growled. That low, rumbling growl he rarely ever used unless he saw something he didn't like. I had been half asleep in my bunk, the fire in the stove burning low, casting a weak orange flicker on the walls. I sat up and saw him standing near the door, ears up, head lowered. At first, I thought it was probably just a deer or maybe a raccoon. The woods were full of movement at night, but Murphy didn't bark. He just growled, pacing slowly by the door. I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no twigs snapping, just the wind brushing through the trees. I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. It was cold, the kind of cold that dries out your throat the second you breathe. Murphy stood right beside me. I scanned the woods with my flashlight. Nothing, just trees and the crunch of leaves from the breeze. But I noticed he wouldn't go down the steps. He just stared into the dark, ears stiff. I stayed out there for a few minutes. Nothing moved. Eventually, I went back inside and pushed the table up against the door, just in case. I felt a little silly doing it, but the growl stuck in my mind. I kept the rifle beside the bed and left my boots on that night. The next morning, I walked out to check around the cabin. I found nothing strange. No broken branches, no tracks, no signs anything had been close. Murphy stayed close to my leg the whole walk, which was unlike him. Normally, he darted ahead or sniffed at trees. That day, he didn't leave my side. By the time night rolled around again, the sky had gone overcast. No stars, no moonlight. Everything was darker than usual. I tried to read a book I brought, but I couldn't focus. Murphy kept lifting his head toward the window like he was listening for something. And then, just like the night before, sometime past midnight, he growled again. This time, I didn't get up. I just sat there and waited. I kept the rifle in my lap. Murphy stood by the window, tense, staring out like he could see something I couldn't. Again, I didn't hear anything, but something felt wrong. That gut feeling you get when someone's watching you, even if there's no one there. At dawn, I checked the woods again. Still nothing, but I was starting to feel on edge. I hadn't seen another person in days, and now 2 nights in a row Murphy was acting like someone or something was out there. I tried to shake it off, telling myself maybe a bear had been hanging around or a coyote. Murphy could be sensing smells I couldn't. The 5th night, it escalated. It was colder than any night before. I had the stove going hot, every lamp lit. I wasn't taking chances. I didn't even try to sleep. I just sat at the table watching the front door while Murphy laid facing it too. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. A crunch outside the window. Not wind, not branches. A single, sharp step on dry leaves. Murphy snapped up, teeth bared. Then another step. Then silence. I stood up, rifle in hand, and walked slowly toward the door. I didn't open it. I just stood there, holding my breath, straining my ears. There was breathing, soft, just outside the wall. I froze. Every part of me tightened. Murphy didn't growl this time. He stood, tail down, staring at the wall like he was waiting for whatever it was to move. After a minute, the breathing stopped. No steps, no retreat, just nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I walked the area again. This time I found something. Tracks, boot prints. Not mine. About 50 feet from the cabin, behind a tree, I found them. The prints came from the woods, stopped at the tree, then turned back the way they came. They looked fairly recent, maybe made during the night. The tread was different from my boots, narrower, deeper in the heel. Someone had been standing out there watching the cabin. I felt sick. That kind of sick where your stomach turns and your hands go cold. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't imagination. This was real. I packed up that morning, tossed everything into the truck, and drove out fast. I didn't even eat, just got in and left. When I got home, I reported it to the local sheriff. He said it was probably just a hunter who wandered too close. Told me the woods were full of people like that this time of year. I didn't believe it. Not with how quiet that guy had been. Not with how long he just stood there. I haven't gone back to the cabin since. I still have it. Still pay the taxes. But something about that night stuck with me. Murphy's old now. Slower. But every time we go for a walk and he stops, ears stiff, nose high, I feel that same chill. That same wrongness I felt out there at Tanner's Ridge. Because I know what I heard. And more than that, I know someone stood just a few feet away from my wall, breathing in the dark, waiting for something. And I don't want to know what. It was the fall of 2022 when I decided to take some time off and head out to the woods in Idaho. I had been working nonstop for over a year at a small plumbing company back in Spokane. Things were hectic, and I hadn't had a single weekend where I wasn't on call or dealing with emergency jobs. My boss finally told me to take a break or I'd burn out. So I did. I didn't want a fancy vacation or anything like that. I just wanted quiet, peace, maybe some hiking and cold air. I had an old family cabin about 3 hours out from the city, deep in the woods near Cascade. My grandfather built it back in the 70s, and my dad kept it up until he passed a few years ago. It hadn't been used much since then, but I knew it was still standing. No running water, no electricity, just a wood stove, a hand pump for water, and a thick metal door that kept bears out. I packed light. A couple days worth of canned food, warm clothes, a lantern, batteries, a good knife, and my .38 revolver just in case I ran into anything wild. It wasn't bear season yet, but you never know. I left early on a Thursday morning, driving my old pickup through back roads and dirt trails until I finally reached the narrow path that led down to the cabin. It took some work clearing the branches and overgrowth, but eventually I made it. The place looked about how I expected, aged, but still standing strong. The wooden porch creaked as I stepped on it, and some moss had grown around the windows. The air was cold and quiet. No sounds of cars or people. Just birds and wind and the occasional crack of a branch under some squirrel or deer. I opened the door. Dust filled the air immediately. I spent the first couple hours cleaning, shaking out blankets, sweeping the floor, stacking firewood inside, checking the stove. The metal chimney was still intact, though rusted. I lit a small fire to test the draft, and it burned clean. That night, I cooked a can of chili over the fire and sat alone in the quiet. The second day started well. I hiked out to a nearby creek where I used to fish with my dad. It was barely a trickle this time of year, but it brought back memories. I spent hours walking, following old trails, noticing animal tracks in the mud. When I got back around sunset, I felt relaxed for the first time in months. Then came the third night. It started normal. I had just finished eating and was stoking the fire when I thought I heard something outside. just faint footsteps or maybe a branch snapping. I froze and listened, but it didn't come again. Probably a raccoon, I figured. Still, I went outside with my flashlight just to check. The beam of light cut through the trees, bouncing off trunks and fallen logs. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, shining the light out into the dark woods. Nothing, just wind. I went back in and locked the door behind me. Later that night, while I was trying to sleep, I woke up to a dull knock. Not loud, just one, like something brushing the side of the cabin. My eyes opened fast. I didn't move right away. I just listened. Nothing else came. I figured maybe a pine cone or something fell from a branch and hit the wall. The trees around here were tall and full of deadwood. I fell back asleep eventually. The next morning was cloudy and gray. I stepped outside to check around the cabin again. That's when I noticed something that didn't sit right. On the side of the cabin, under the window near the stove, there were 3 marks in the dirt. They looked like boot prints, just faint enough to be washed out from wind or frost, but still visible. They weren't mine. They were larger than my feet, and the tread didn't match my hiking boots. I looked around the whole area, walking in slow circles. No other prints, just those 3, like someone had stood there and then left the same way they came. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe they were older prints I missed before. Still, I kept my revolver closer that day. I even carried it in a side holster instead of leaving it in my bag. That afternoon, I sat on the porch with my back to the door, watching the trees and the path. Nothing moved except birds. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The peace I felt on the first day was gone. That night, I didn't sleep right away. I kept the lantern on for a while and sat up in the corner of the cabin near the door, listening. Hours went by, just wind, the fire crackling, and my heartbeat. I dozed off at some point. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up to a new sound. This time, it wasn't soft or distant. It was the door handle, someone trying to turn it, slow and careful. I froze in place. My heart was racing so hard I could barely hear anything else. I didn't move. The door was locked, solid metal. It didn't open, but whoever was on the other side tried it again. One twist, pause, then another. Then silence. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. Eventually, I crawled over, grabbed my revolver, and stood at the side of the door. I didn't open it. I just stood there listening. After what felt like an hour, I finally sat back down in the corner and waited for morning. I didn't sleep. When daylight came, I stepped outside.
No footprints.
Nothing on the path. It was like nothing had happened, but I knew what I heard. That day, I decided I wouldn't stay another night. I packed my things quickly, loaded the truck, and made one last check around the cabin. As I came around the back, I found something that made my blood run cold. There was a small bundle tied with twine, left just under the back window. It looked like sticks at first, but when I picked it up, it wasn't just random branches. It was a shape like a figure. Someone had taken the time to bind it into a form with legs and arms. There was a tiny cloth tied around the head like a hood. It looked handmade. I dropped it. I didn't know what kind of message it was meant to send, but I knew it wasn't something I wanted to find again. Someone had been out there, watching, maybe more than once, and they were close. I didn't stop packing. I didn't even eat. I got in my truck, turned the key, and drove straight out, barely slowing down for the turns. Every branch or shadow in the woods looked like a person. I didn't go back to that cabin again after that. A few weeks later, I told my uncle about it and he offered to check on the place with some friends from town. They didn't find anything unusual, no figure, no prints, no damage. But I knew what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. I ended up selling the property a few months later to a guy who wanted hunting land. I didn't tell him about the figure or the door handle. Maybe it was nothing, maybe someone passing through, but it felt too personal. Too close. There are people out in those woods. Not everyone out there is camping or hunting. Some just watch. Some wait. And if I hadn't locked that door, I don't know what would have happened.